Italiano su Zoom abbiamo dovuto cambiare il canale. Abbiamo messo 1.
Pourquoi?
Perché non si sentiva da fuori.
Ok.
Allora provi qua.
Alors, italiano et uno. Qu'est-ce que tu dis? Bon, italiano o uno o quattro.
One.
English, you are going to speak English. So there is no English because
right,
it's the original
okay.
language.
Oh, okay, so one. I just need. So I'll listen to Italian. I'll tell you to Italian for the French. Okay, that's fine. Gotcha. Gotcha.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome for the people who are here at the USG in the Religious Center here in Rome at the Regina Mundi, and for the welcome to the people who are following us in streaming in English, Italian, French, and Spanish. I'm sorry I have to speak English because for the original language, we have technical problems. So I'm Patrizia Morgante. I'm the communication officer of the USG. The USG is the International Union of Superior General. And we are very happy, very, very happy to have here Sister Annmarie Sanders. She's the communication officer of the LCWR, the Leadership Conference of Women Religious in the United States. Welcome. She does an incredible work, so we invite her to help us today to reflect on communication together with Philip, but tomorrow and Saturday she will run a workshop for communicators or for general counselors, for people who are interested in understanding the challenge of communication for religious life. And believe me, it's a huge challenge, believe me. During this period with the Synod, it's really challenging how we can give voice to the sisters to tell their mission in Brazil or in other countries where people suffer. So tomorrow morning we will have a press conference here with the 10 religious sisters who are representing the USG at the Synod. So pray for us, pray for them. Welcome, Philip. Thank you. Philip Pulella, he's a journalist. He was born in Italy, but then he moved in the United States, so he's American actually, but he has Italian roots. He worked as senior correspondent for the Reuters, for Italy and Vatican issues. So welcome, Philip. Thank you for accepting our invitation for this dialogue. It's a dialogue between a religious sister working in the communication field for religious sisters and a journalist who has to deal with many issues, men and women, but today we will challenge you to talk about which is the voice from your point of view of the religious sisters or women in the church. I just want to highlight the theme that Pope Francis has chosen for the World Day on Social Communication for 2020. The quotation from the Gospel is, "So you can tell your son and your grandson." And the theme is, life creates history. I think it's a really challenging theme for all of us. And our religious sisters throughout the world create a lot of history and stories. We have to find a way to tell these stories. So this meeting is to reflect on two aspects that seem a little bit contradictory. Sorry, my English is poor, but I think you can understand. The first element is we notice an invisibility of the voice of religious sisters and women in general in the mainstream communication of the church. The second, it's a great interest on religious women mission. I see like a contradiction. Many foundations, organizations are contacting USG to invite religious sisters to speak, to invite religious sisters to be partners. Oh, wonderful, but you know, I think religious sisters need their space to say their voice. So this is our role as communicators, right? Okay, so the first question is just to warm up a little bit the atmosphere is, can you tell us something, both of you, about your work, your daily work?
We're sharing the microphone? Good.
You share one microphone.
Good.
And men and women sharing it.
Well, what do I do? I'm a journalist for Reuters. I've been with Reuters nearly 40 years, most of them here in Rome. I cover predominantly the Vatican, Italy. I've traveled, I've done more than 135 papal trips with 3 popes on the papal plane, so I have a lot of experience. And I've basically covered the Vatican and the Roman Catholic Church, but most of the Vatican will get to the distinction a little bit later during all of this period. And in 2018, I became the first and so far the only American journalist to have interviewed a pope when I sat down with Pope Francis for 2 hours alone on June the 17th of 2018. And I definitely the highlight of my career. And I think that's all you need to know.
So I work as the communications director for the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. And that's a conference that represents about 300 communities of Catholic sisters. We have about 1,400 members. So if you work in communications for your own community or for a conference of religious or for a confederation of religious, as I see our colleagues in the back from CLAR, our work is probably all about the same. So any publications they're my responsibility. All the work with the media is my responsibility, and all the social media as well. And I've been with LCWR, the acronym for the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, for 16 years.
Thank you to both of you. And the first question is very easy, but it's key, I would say. Which is the image of religious sister that is most common in your reality? Which kind of image of a religious sister comes up working in your reality? So,
Me. Okay. Well, I think it depends on the period of history that you're talking. As I was growing up as a kid, obviously I was educated by the Scalabrinian sisters in New York City. Yeah, I was educated by the Scalabrinian sisters in New York City at the Our Lady of Pompeii School in Manhattan in Greenwich Village, and they were basically dealing with immigrant children of immigrants. That was the charism of their order. So, I mean, we always grew up with, the men were in charge, the men were the ones who spoke up, and the priests in the parish were the ones who made the decisions, and they were on the front lines, essentially, in that sense. And the nuns did the teaching. Now, obviously, as we know, as time moved on, things began changing, and they continue to change, not as fast as, in my opinion, they should be changing. But I think that the common image of sisters out there are the ones who basically do the heavy lifting, essentially, for the church. And I think that needs to be recognized more than it is now. And then I think it's just not the sisters, it's also just women in general. I can tell you that, for example, my sister's godmother essentially runs one of the largest parishes on Staten Island. There's a priest there or two, I think, but she's doing most of the work. And I once spoke to Cardinal Sandri after he had come back from a tour of the Middle East, and he basically said that, you know, a good part of the parishes there, if it were not for a woman who was actually running things, they would have to shut down. They wouldn't have anything. So you have this kind of this difference between actually the people who are doing the bulk of the work but don't have the bulk of the visibility or the authority. So that's, I think, in a nutshell, that's what probably the way I would define it today.
Yeah, I think I would agree with especially that last part, that sisters are doing so much of the important work of the church, but it goes unrecognized. I'd also say, and I apologize because I'm probably speaking from the perspective of the United States, but often in the media, I think reporters think of Catholic sisters as very old, that our communities are dying out. And often they think that we're dying out. A, they think we're dying out, and B, they think we're dying out because we've done something wrong, that we, you know, didn't live religious life as well as our predecessors did, so now it's ending. And many people say, you know, once you left the schools, everything changed, that the public no longer knew who Catholic sisters were. Or once you took off your habit, people didn't know who you were. So because of that, I don't think it's true, but I think there's a perception that because we made changes in our life to respond to the needs of the times, that we did something wrong and now people aren't entering religious life. So I think there's a lack of education on the whole history of religious life and how it's grown at times and been small at times. So that period from the 1900s to the 1960s, when so many young women entered religious life, was really an anomaly. So these large numbers that we have now of sisters, at least in the United States, in their 70s and 80s and 90s, is an unusual thing. And you know, there are many factors that led to young women entering their communities in those large numbers at that time, especially around right before and after World War II. That was kind of the rise of a strong Catholic identity in the United States. Catholics had large families. They could spare a daughter or two to religious life. And then there was that idea that, you know, going into religious life, it gave you a good education. Your status in society was a little bit higher. So now all of those women who entered in large groups, they're dying out, and we're returning to a number that was more consistent with the history of religious life, that we tended to be smaller. So my hope is that journalists would understand that the small number it's okay as well. And the other, you know, image that I think often comes up is of that very stereotypical image of sisters as naive or docile who are simply doing what they're told to do and very separated from the world. And as you all know, that's about the farthest thing from the truth. So that sisters are usually so engaged in the real issues of society, but we're not always portrayed that way.
I'm taking on what you're saying, and I must say that I'm very surprised because I see it. I didn't see these, perhaps because of the job that I do, or because of the sisters that I have known, which basically, from the time that I was 18 or 25, been more like you rather than the sisters who educated me when I was a kid, and I was pretty bad too. I was a bad kid in school. Anyway, so it surprises me actually because, as again, maybe it's because of the job that I do that I'm very, very much aware of the things that sisters do, and also that the numbers are. I mean, compared to male vocations, I think that you have a lot more, and you basically your number is at the very least steady. So I never thought of that, and I really don't know whether that's completely true around the world. I think that even for example, my nieces now, or my grandnieces, if you want to, as well, that are going to Catholic schools, so they're being taught by sisters who dress like you, and they're appreciated. So I think that it came as a surprise to me what you just said. So I'm not sure whether maybe because I've been around women like you, that the last thing I would say is that you're meek and submissive.
I would think for someone like yourself who sisters personally, you would know that most of us aren't meek or submissive. But I think for journalists who haven't had any experience with Catholic sisters, that image is often still out there.
From what you are sharing, it's like a confirmation of a conversation that I had yesterday with some religious men and women, where the stereotype that I interpret like a stereotype of sisters and religious men is that finally sisters work at the grassroots level, they work, and then the men think or have the power to do something. So or we change the meaning of authority, or we keep saying that the sisters do not think, do not study, they just work. So I don't know if it's, it might be a stereotype that perhaps as communicators we can work to change it. So let's go more. I hope to have some conflict because you agree too much. It's not interesting. Now, what I would like to ask, and I would like to ask
Can I say something before you continue? Again, I'd like to challenge that because the sisters, again, that I've known that have, masters with them, university educated, but yesterday I did this thing at the U.S. Embassy, and one of the three speakers, I moderated this panel. It was a Irish sister who is in South Sudan. Her name will come back to me in a second. When she's working she's basically working somewhere away from the capital, and runs a school and kind of like a shelter for kids who were caught up in the Civil War. And then there was another sister from Nigeria who is doing something with all kinds of people of all ages that were displaced by Boko Haram. And then there was a sister from India who is basically providing some basic health care. And she's a doctor, she's an MD, So as far as the thinking is concerned, they know how to think and they're very qualified and educated. In many cases, more than me. I just have a BS. I don't have a master's. My daughter is more educated than I am, as far as she has a master's. But I was the first in my family to go to university. So I think we're talking about the difference between of exercising power and authority. That's where the difference comes in. I don't think that the men out there are any more educationally or intellectually qualified. This is, I think, perhaps one of the things that I've seen over the past, say, 20, 30 years is that the sisters today are educationally much more qualified than they were before, because many of them were just sort of elementary school teachers, high school teachers. Now they're very, very qualified.
Philip, I think that you touched the key point of this meeting, that the reality of what the sisters are do not come up in the communication. So there is like two levels: the sisters, the life, the mission of the sisters, and this is not reflected in the mainstream communication. So I follow up with the question. I meant to do it with you, but now I will start with you. So what the sisters should do, should know to make their voice, their real life more visible, more known in the mainstream communication of the church? Help us.
Well, it depends on whether you want to or not. I mean, I think that, you necessarily don't want to be, superstars. It depends on whether you, I mean, if you're asking me whether you should sort of, begin an active program to sort of, tell the media what, this order or that order does, then I think that the individual sisters and individual orders need to decide whether they want to do that. And they may not want to do that. They may want to remain, I don't want to say in the shadows, but in the background, because that maybe they'll get more work done and actually have better results in the end, rather than sort of, being on the pulpit, if you want. So that's an individual choice. I guess individual in the sense of individual sisters and also orders. But I'm sure that Annmarie, will address this issue better than me. But if you do take that step, then you need to know the media, and you need to know the various differences in different types of media, modern media, digital media. And you need to have personal contacts with the media on a local basis wherever you are, and in Annmarie's case, in sort of a national level as well, because you're communications for an umbrella group. But you need to know your journalists very carefully, and I think we can get back into those kind of details, because if I say them now, then I may not have anything else to say later.
Question for Annmarie is the opposite. Okay. So, which is the stereotypes that you see in the communication of the mainstream communication for when they speak about sisters? Not only, I mean, I'm sure that you come from your perspective, but I mean, you have a huge experience. I read your CV. So, can you tell us something about what he should know about religious sisters?
Well, I think, yeah, right. I have a feeling Philip is not our typical journalist, because you know an awful lot about sisters and understand that we are well educated. But if you could say to some of your colleagues that I'd like to tell you a story first about, I was present for an interview with a newly elected U.S. woman congressperson in the United States. Her name was Marcy Kaptur. And when she started in the Congress, she was overwhelmed by everything that she needed to learn about, with so many issues happening in the United States. So she went to the Speaker of the House. So the Speaker of the House is in charge of the whole Congress, and said to him, Tip O'Neill, said to him, how do you do it? How do you stay on top of all the issues that are going on in this country? And he said, oh, it's easy. I just follow what the nuns tell me. And that was kind of a startling answer. And, when I asked her to explain a little bit more, she said, well, the speaker said, I have complete confidence in sisters. They're on the ground working in all of the places of greatest need, places of poverty. They understand the impact of the decisions that we make as members of Congress. They understand that impact on the lives of people directly. And they have no agenda, that they're there simply to advocate for the people that they serve. And they're well educated and they're thoughtful. So I completely trust their position. And it gave me a new insight into how we can better serve as Catholic sisters. That we do have people in so many places, whether it's working with victims of human trafficking, working with people who are in the most desperate places of poverty, people who don't have health care, access to health care. So if people could come to us more often, and journalists included, to say, what are you seeing? So if we're covering whatever issue as journalists, could we contact a Catholic sister who's involved? And maybe you're right, I do agree that not all Catholic sisters want to be out there in the media, but they have a lot of knowledge and a lot of insight. So perhaps they can even, speak off the record to a reporter. But our voice is unique and pretty important, I think. But I also agree with you, Philip, that not every sister wants to be recognized. And there is something about the training that sisters received in the past, that being humble, however people defined humility, was a big value. So speaking about ourselves as individuals, was kind of frowned upon for many years. So I think we as communicators for religious life have to work hard with some sisters to have them feel comfortable to speak about themselves, and to, believe that they should be putting themselves out as spokespersons at times.
Just to follow up that on, I think that that there's, ideally there should be a choice about whether a sister or her order or both or either wants to move up, and not saying up, but to be more visible, talk to the media, reach a place of prominence or not. It's the same thing, actually, because we make not too much of a distinction between men and women in the church. Is that I remember that the Pope Francis once said, that he was talking about all the problems in the Curia, and he said, but there's problems, there's corruption, there's this and that, but there are also a lot of saints who do their work there, on a daily basis, and people don't know who they are because they're not heads of dicasteries, et cetera, et cetera. The difference is that the female side doesn't have a choice of whether you really want to speak in a louder voice, for lack of a better phrase right now, or have a position of influence and a decision-making role. So the difference is that if a man wants to remain, in the background, or just do his work and just remain he can. But if he also wants to rise and become, powerful and influential and reach the decision-making levels of the church, he can do that a lot easier than men. And I think that that's the thing that needs to be changed to allow, in this sense, equal choice. You want to remain in the backgrounds, or you want to get to the decision-making levels in the hierarchies of the church. And then I have my own report card of the Pope on this. We can get into that later.
Philip, if you had to give 3 tips 3 concrete tips to religious sisters to be effective with press, what would you say to them?
More than 3. I mean, first of all, one of the things, I'm sorry, there's more than 3 tips, but first of all, I think if you're dealing on a local level, or it makes a difference whether you're dealing on a local level, say a state level, regional level, or a national level, okay, so that makes a difference. And then you have your own hierarchy, I guess, whereas maybe, I don't know, maybe some sisters feel that they need the permission of the Mother Superior to go public with something, to give interviews. So I think it's the way the order may be structured, that whether sister somewhere can give an interview to the local press without asking permission. I think that they should be able to decide themselves. But yeah, some tips. I mean, basically, you got to know your local media, or in your case, national media, who they are, whether they're qualified. And by qualified, I don't mean whether they are Catholic or whether they know, the ins and outs of Catholicism or Catholic doctrine, whether they're good journalists, whether they're fair journalists. Doesn't matter whether they're Catholics. I knew a guy who covered the Vatican here for a long time. He was Jewish. He did a great job. You don't have to be Catholic to cover the Vatican. There's many times I think the Vatican would benefit from having non-Catholics cover the Vatican, more non-Catholics. But so you have to know your journalists, do your homework. It's very easy now, because on the internet you can look up somebody and see what kind of writing that they did before, whether it looks balanced or not, whether it's kind of, crazy, whether it's off the wall, whether it's balanced, whether there's in there saying, whether you can tell, because you're all intelligent, you're all educated, etc. So it's easy to tell if you look at something that someone has written, hopefully someone like me, and you'll say, okay, that's balanced, that's okay. And you look at something else and say, this is a bit off the wall. So before you talk to somebody, do your homework about the person you're going to be talking to. Second, be very clear about what the ground rules are, okay? So if it's off the record, it's off the record. If it's on the record, it's on the record. Be very, very careful. If you do say, it's building up some trust on a local basis as well. So be careful that you don't trust people in my profession too easily. Okay, be careful before you trust a reporter. I shouldn't say that, but
You are recording.
huh?
You are recording.
That's okay. I don't care. No. I'm not. I'm saying what I believe. So be careful before you trust a reporter, in the sense that you have to know where that person comes from, whether that person has an agenda. And many Catholic journalists today have an agenda. And they're is one of the things that I'm really dismayed about, is that the Catholic press has gone into sort of pockets of agendas on the right or the left, mostly on the right. So you have to know who you're talking to, set the ground rules, know who they are, but also develop personal relationships with the media, either on a local, regional, or a national level, so that you know who to call. Say, I think I have an interesting story for you, or as Annmarie was saying, that the sisters are on the ground. They probably know, particularly in developing countries, more about healthcare issues and problems than some government officials themselves. So have contact with people, and I'll get to the
Comment something?
So one of the things that I find is that it's hard to pitch a story to a reporter, especially if it's a good news story, something positive. And you mentioned conflict before, Philip, that at least we find in the United States that we're not usually of a lot of interest to many reporters unless there's some conflict going on. And that's when we're called in. So I find you know, if everything's going okay and we say to a reporter, would you like to cover this, you know, really good thing that we're doing on poverty, or it's really great, interesting thing we're doing around victims of human trafficking? There might be a little interest, but maybe not. But if there's an issue of controversy, especially with the church, especially with the hierarchical church, we're the first ones called. You know, everybody wants to know what the Catholic sisters feel about something that the bishops or the cardinals did or the Vatican did. And that's not always where we want to speak. You know, sometimes it's a good opportunity to say something positive about our experience with the church, but that's not always what we want to be speaking about. We don't always want to be addressing just the conflictual things that are happening. And then there's the difficulty too that as Catholic sisters, we belong to a community. So when you're talking about, you know, often sisters do have to have a permission of their superior to speak. I mean, it makes sense unless she's speaking about just her own life or her own ministry. But if she's being asked to comment perhaps on a larger issue, it is a little tricky when you're a single member of a community. So that often it holds people up. You know, if I say to a journalist, well, I have something I want to say about that, but I have to check with my community, and then I have to try to get my superior, and you know, and I can't get back to you until tomorrow. That's another thing that I think is hard, the immediacy and the quickness of the news cycle. That by the time we're ready to speak about something, you know, the story's old already.
Thank you very much, both of you. But you know, this is a dialogue, so I would like you to think. If you have comments or you have questions, feel free to ask both of them, because it's a huge opportunity to have such a good, you know, expert people, but at the same time different. So I have other questions ready, of course, but you know, if you have a question, and this invitation is also for the people who are following us online, they can write their questions on the chat, or they can ask the flow to my colleague, Sister Therese, and you can talk live actually, so we can see you and you can ask the question directly or comment, not just ask the question. So get ready for that. I have another question for you, Annmarie. It's about how are you equipping sisters to deal with the press? And what are the challenges that you face as communicator with the sisters? Because it's not just for your congregation, it's for a federation.
Right. Well, one of the big challenges is what I think I mentioned before, the training that sisters had in the past to kind of blend in, that we were, sisters older than I am, were trained to just be one of many, so not to stand out. So that's a hurdle still to get over, to help sisters see that that's part of our mission now, to speak out, to be more public with what we believe about what we've lived, what our ministries are. In my case, working for the Conference of Women Religious, I'm working with all leaders. So media training is very important. We really want every leader to feel confident to speak with the press. And we try to say that, especially when our conference takes a stance on an issue, that they can also carry that same stance out on their local levels. So we're constantly getting sisters, trying to get sisters trained to be comfortable writing opinion pieces for their local newspapers, or to be writing letters to the editor. But one of the big things is to train leaders in crisis communications. That probably every leader at some point in her term will face something very difficult in her own community that she'll have to address. So just getting sisters to feel confident in themselves that they can speak on difficult issues from a place of their own values, to speak in a way that's respectful of whoever they may be confronting in their own, whatever the situation is that they're being called upon to talk about. So I think it's a growing edge for us that sisters just haven't been thinking, especially with social media today, that we have so many opportunities for sisters to get their voice out there, but it hasn't been part of our past to kind of advertise who we are.
This is where I think that the younger sisters obviously that are more comfortable with social media, have a role in teaching the older sisters, not necessarily how to use it as much, but what it is about, maybe use it. But in any community, I imagine that there are older sisters and younger sisters. Let the younger sister deal with social media, do social media, teach the older sisters how to use social media, or at least understand it, because you have a sort of a font of knowledge, which is right there. You don't have to go outside your own community. I would imagine that you have younger people who can help you with social media if you need to be if you need help with it. There's a lot of positive sides to something like Twitter and Facebook, but there's also a lot of dangers there. So you need to sort of be careful about how you use it. Another thing I wanted to say is that because Annmarie was talking about trying to sell a good story. If you have a good story to tell, your first target or your first port of call should be the local press. Because the local press, I say press, media, TV, radio, whatever it is, the local media is always looking for a good local story, because that's what it's all about. If you find a story about a group of nuns that are helping refugees or something, and they're based in your small town or mid-sized town or something, it's much easier to sell that story to local media, because you always see in local American newspapers or local television station, I don't know, so-and-so, who, was born around the corner, is now, etc. It's much easier on a national level or a bigger level. Good stories, as Sister said, are much more difficult to sell because there's just so much going on. And it's kind of one of my journalism professors a long time ago said, would you ever write a story if you were I was in New York at the time, that 3 million commuters, made their way to work today without accidents, and everybody's fine, happy they got to work on time. No, there's no story there. Train crashes, it's a story. So you have to look for opportunities to get into the local media with good stories. The other thing is, maybe teach you a trick of the trade. You were saying before about having to get permission from your superior before saying something. If you tell a reporter right away that I have to get permission from my superior to talk about this or something like that, if you know that you probably will get permission, and it may be just sort of like, the nuances, don't say I have to talk to my superior. Just say, okay, let's talk tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. In the meantime, get permission from your superior, how far you could go, and then just show up. And then if the superior says, you can't, then just say what you can say. Don't tell them. Because then it looks like you're not independent, and you are. You can use tricks like that.
Thank you again. We can open the question, comments from you and from the people who are online. So feel free to write your questions on the chat, or please ask the floor, because it's interesting also to see the people that are online. I don't know if you can visualize them. We can try. Okay. I have a question for you from the, I think, the English room. I like to hear more about how the communication for religious congregations need to be able to speak in a crisis before the leaders do. In my experience, it's helpful to have the communicator to be the first public voice. Actually, this is a question for both of you. And also, I think it's also for you. Who's for Philippe? Annmarie first.
Well, I would definitely agree with that, that if your congregation is experiencing crisis, definitely your communicator is the lead person. And of course, she's been working with the major superiors. So in a crisis like that, that would naturally, your communicator would be the spokesperson.
Right. I don't think you can have sort of, you need to have a sort of a unified response to a crisis, and not everybody is used to or has a lot of experience in dealing with crisis communications. There are crisis communications experts out there. So it's become almost the field in itself. Not that you're trying to hide something, but if you say something which is, I don't know, slightly off or not sure, then you'll get into more trouble for what you've said or what you have not said. So in crisis, you have to sort of be very, very careful, because then there are legal issues and all kinds of other things that come into play. It's not, so you definitely, and you also need to respond as quickly as possible. I mean, that was always true, even in, the days of just, daily newspapers and et cetera. But now it's even more, it's more true now with the speed of the media. So if you have no comment for the time being, say no comment. If you don't wait too long, so I'll get back to you on that as quickly as I can, and do that with the little, even if you don't know everything, say what you can say, but leave it in the hands of a professional if it's a crisis.
I have a comment from the English room and another question for you, so I will do it later. The comment is, we can also say, I cannot speak on behalf of the community, but from a personal perspective, I can say or offer these. We cannot be adults and act like little girls in public. Surely, to goodness, we know our congregation, and again, we can speak from a personal point and say it does not represent the congregation. What do you think?
Yeah.
I think that's a tricky question. I think every congregation would have to make that decision themselves. I think most of the leaders who I work with would probably prefer that their members not do that publicly as they speak to a reporter. If their leader has that understanding that every sister has a right to speak, then that would be a different story. But certainly something you would want to clarify with your leader before doing that.
Yeah, I mean, if you do decide to speak on a personal level, you really have to stress that and say, 7 times, I'm not speaking in the name of my order, but I'm speaking, as Annmarie, who lives in Mineola, happens to be a nun, something like that. It's really very delicate, and I think that I agree with Sister that it should be avoided if possible, because there really is no way. No, I'll take that back. It is very difficult to say something you're saying just on a personal level, which is not reflective of your congregation. I'll give you a very concrete example. Is that just recently there was something here at the Vatican where there were a lot of people from Silicon Valley. They were talking about, there was a symposium. The Pope even addressed them. And it was in the Synod Hall, I think, wherever it was. Anyway, there was somebody from Facebook. It was a top lawyer for Facebook. And there was somebody else from another company in Silicon Valley. And on the program, they both had, in parentheses, speaking in a personal capacity. When I looked at that, I said to myself as a reporter, I said, "Yeah, I'm sorry, you can't have it both ways. You can't say on the program, I work for Facebook, and then, you know, I'm just speaking in a personal capacity." And then the person, he actually, when he gave his address, he was talking about, he said, you know, I'm speaking in a personal capacity, and then described how Facebook reacted to the shootings in the mosques in New Zealand, and what they had, you know, these automatic things that kicked in to stop these videos from going viral. And so it became very blurry. So in the end, in my story, I said, out of courtesy, because that's what he said, that he's speaking in a personal capacity. But he's speaking in a personal capacity and then describing what his company did, the line was very, very blurred. So I don't, my instincts as a reporter, someone says I'm speaking as a personal capacity, I say, yeah, come on. So if you do that, you know, do it with someone who you trust, or just wait and see whether you can, speak as a sister of such and such an order, but you say I'm just speaking as myself. It doesn't always work. I mean, more times than not, it doesn't work.
You're saying, because actually the digital world allows sisters to come out from the invisibility, use the let's say institutional spaces, but, you know, free actually from the, you know, journalist or from a magazine. It's also true that now it's very difficult to separate what is private and what is public. So it's difficult for a sister who represent, in a way, belongs a congregation to say, I'm speaking on the personal level or on the institutional level.
I think in Twitter, it's understood that it's a personal level in Twitter. There's a difference between crisis. I thought we were talking about crisis management and bigger stories. On a personal level, you see all kinds of sisters out there, Sister Preaching, or all kinds of other people that have their Twitter accounts, and they comment on what is going on. We're talking about, you know, well-educated, very smart adult women. They definitely can have an opinion, and I think it's in Twitter you can. For example, there's the usual disclaimer. It says that, you know, on your Twitter account, I'm speaking on behalf of myself and on behalf of the Sisters of Charity or whatever. So in Twitter, it's very easy. I'm talking about when you're doing something, an interview for a newspaper article, a television article, or something like that, to be very, very clear if you're speaking on a personal level. Twitter is a personal thing. You're not speaking. I mean, if the Sisters of Charity or whatever sisters have their own group account, then that is managed by someone who's speaking for the company, the order, the congregation, whatever. Whereas an individual sister speaks for herself, I think it's understood. I'm not saying that sisters should not communicate. I mean, use social media because they feel timid. They should be out there like everybody else with opinions about what's going on. Yeah.
Thank you. We have some other comments or questions from the Spanish group. Non possiamo fare il collegamento. Okay. Un consejo que I will tell in Spanish, so you have to take your number 4. Un consejo. Are you okay? Not yet. Can you hear the translation? Un consejo que puedan brindar a aquellas congregaciones religiosas que en el campo de la comunicación no tienen apertura, porque quizá no entra en su apostolado o carisma. ¿Qué dirían sobre esta postura? I can tell you in Okay, I can tell you in English, yeah. The translator should do it again, please. I will tell it again in Spanish because I cannot translate, it's not reliable. Un consejo que puedan brindar. Can you hear? They are listening to me. Okay, anyway, she would like to, Sister Noelia would like to hear a suggestion for the congregations who do not have any, that within the charism, there is nothing about communication, and neither in their apostolate. So what would you suggest for this kind of congregations?
Well, even if communication isn't in the charism, I think communication is part of human life. So I can't imagine that any community wouldn't be interested in communication. So I would say take any opportunity that you can to use social media to the fullest extent, to, if the community doesn't yet have a website, to begin starting something like that, to make contact with your local media as any time that you can if you have a story that is out there.
Because the translators are downstairs, and also the streaming is downstairs. So I'm sorry, we are trying to connect the world. So there's another question for Annmarie from the Spanish group. Get ready with your question, with your questions now. Quiero preguntar a la hermana Annmarie cuáles son los riesgos. I would like to ask Sister Annmarie, what are the risks of the communication and what are the risks of the not communication?
Well, I'd say the risks of communicating would be that once you put your stance out publicly, you certainly take the chance that people will respond negatively. So that you need to be prepared for any kind of response that might come your way. And sometimes those come through donors, that donations may stop coming to your community because of a stance you've taken. You may anger people who've known your community in one way for years and would not expect you to take a stance that you've taken. So I think you have to be prepared for that. To not speak would also be a great risk, that if this is what our life is about, to proclaim the gospel values, if we would, we've been called not to keep our light under a bushel basket. So I think that's part of who we are as women religious, to speak out about any injustice that we see, to speak out about opportunities that we see to serve the world in better ways. So to not take advantage of those opportunities, to me, seems to be being less than who we are called to be as women religious today.
Yeah, I would agree. I would just add that particularly if you're using Twitter to wear body armor, to be ready to take criticism, and to not engage too much with crazies. I mean, just let it go, or wait a little while, calm down, and then respond very, very calmly, because there are people who will. Twitter can be extremely nasty, extremely polarized, extremely partisan. And the last thing you would want to do as a sister is sort of and you're human, you're not made of wood. So, if somebody says something nasty, you want to sort of react. But go slow, take it easy, go have a, walk around the block, come back. I mean, take it easy with Twitter. Don't get engaged. Don't let people who are trying to bait you to be angry, right? Because then the next thing they'll say, you see, sister's not supposed to be angry. She's supposed to be, blah. And so there are people who will try to bait you. So either don't respond or take a couple of hours. Twitter now, people think you have to respond. If you don't respond within 7 seconds, that you're trying to avoid the issue. But that's not necessarily true. People criticize me on Twitter, but then I have a job to do. I have to, go home. I have to go home. I have to eat. I've got, I don't have to respond right away. We respond after 7 hours. It's a response. So if you use Twitter, know how to use it and be prepared to wear some body armor.
That Christians or religious sisters have no right to express the rage, and actually it's part of our life in any way. Not my other consideration, my consideration is that perhaps if you do not communicate, someone else will do it on your behalf. That's what worries me a lot. Because now there is a huge interest, as I was saying in the beginning, on religious sisters. And if you don't take your word, you don't use your voice, someone else will do it on your behalf. So let's just pay attention. We have other comments from the online, but I would like now to just stop the online comments shortly and to see if you have questions from the flow here, from the people on site. So I can move if you have questions or comments. If you have it in another language than English, I will help you to. Oh, English, fantastic. So I don't have to
Please don't put me on the camera. I don't want to be in the camera. First of all, I'd like to say that something that's trending right now doesn't have much to do with sisters, but something that's trending is Ellen DeGeneres's phrase, be kind. And not just to be kind to the people who think like you, but be kind to everybody. One of the things that I find in communication, so important in communication, is this idea that there is good news for us to tell. As religious women, we have been for many decades and possibly centuries, my foundress is one, we were oppressed. Our voices were silenced. It's not as if we have make a decision to speak or not to speak. Sometimes other people decide what we should say and what we should not say. And I think with this idea of asking your superior, for me, we need to learn how to speak from our own authority because we have been called. In baptism, we have been given a voice and we have been given a place at the table. And so I think, at the risk of sounding like some radical feminist, which I am not, although I am a feminist, I think that the radical idea is that we all make a decision that we have something to offer, and that is good news. And so that's what communication invites us to do, is to share our good news from our own authority.
Thank you very much, Brenda. It was very good, your comment. Elizabeth, can you also introduce yourself?
I'm Elizabeth. I'm the Secretary for Communications of Dominican Sisters International. And as I know many congregations who are members of our now confederation, because before we were a movement, there are many congregations who actually they have websites, and also Facebook accounts, official Facebook accounts, but others not. There are congregations who also don't have emails, don't have a website, don't have nothing. But the members of these congregations, maybe individually, they have some accounts of Facebook or Instagram or whatever. So I feel that there is something that is like a fear that the superiors maybe feel in front of these mass media. And what can you recommend about how we can help those superiors or those congregations to be active in the communication with others? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And
Can we gather some other questions and then I will give you
sure.
back the floor?
Perfect.
Thank you, Annmarie. Do you have some other comments in Spanish?
Buenas tardes, soy Davis Fernando Rueda de Comunicaciones de la Confederación Latinoamericana de Religiosos, CLAR.
His name is Davis. He's in charge of communications of the Conference of Religious of Latin America.
Para comunicar en estas nuevas eras digitales es importante la apertura individual y comunitaria en la vida religiosa.
For communicating in this new era of the digital things, it's important to have to be open in a personal and a community way.
Un punto fundamental es poder vencer el miedo que tenemos de usar esos espacios digitales para comunicar.
We have to face the scare of beginning to use these different kind of spaces.
Y tenemos como religiosos y como iglesia la necesidad urgente de poder pasar de ese miedo para convertirlo en una esperanza.
As religious, as church, we have the urgent need to change of this scare to this hope.
Porque como mencionaban anteriormente, si nosotros no somos la voz, otros sí van a ser la voz.
As you mentioned, if we are not the voice, someone else is going to be.
Y nosotros tenemos mucho más contenidos, experiencias que comunicar que la misma prensa internacional.
We have much more contents and experience to share than the international press.
Y tenemos que aprovechar los recursos para poder dar una noticia positiva enfrentando las noticias negativas que circulan diariamente en nuestros medios de comunicación.
We have to use all the resources we have for sharing this positive message against this negative message that we are having in the international way.
Davis is a lay person of 20 years old, 22 years old, it's a passion for religious life. Some other comments or questions from the floor? Okay, the floor is yours.
Well, in many ways, I think Davis answered the first question of how do you convince your leaders that social media is important. You just listen to the passion of a young person who sees that religious life has so much to offer the world, that we can be bringing a whole other message of gospel values, of what's really important, of how to see the world in different ways. So I would say if you can expose your leaders to the thinking of younger people, and I think many young women are coming into religious life through social media. They meet their congregations through their website or through Facebook or on Instagram. So I can only speak of my own congregation that some of our newer members would not have known us. They had no geographic location. They weren't near us, physically, but they met us and liked what we were saying on social media. So I think there's almost no other option, that even if we're afraid of social media, we have to accept it. It's the way of the future.
Yes, I agree. I think that, Sister, when you were saying about, about you have your own voice and you have to be able to not have to ask the Mother Superior or your superiors for permission. I think the distinction that we need to make, or I think that if it's something that has to do with the order specifically, right? Let's say, hypothetically, there's an accusation that involves the order, then you have to speak from the same hymn sheet, right? If it's something that has to do with an issue of social justice in your community or the community at large, I don't think there's any reason for you to feel, or any sister to feel, that they have to ask permission to, you know, to speak out on that. So I think that that's what we were talking about, you know, whether you need to sort of communicate with the superiors about how you're going to respond to a certain thing. But certainly, I don't think you should feel restrained in speaking your mind about other things. Okay, and I think that partially responds to what the Dominican sister also said before.
And I'd also want to add, and this is really the focus of tomorrow's workshop and Saturday, that there's such a hunger right now to hear about the things that are most at the heart of religious life. So where do women religious find meaning? What's our spirituality like? How do we understand God? How do we pray? How do we live without becoming so discouraged by what we see in the world? So I would say any chance for you to speak about those parts of our own lives that probably we kept more private in the past, but that's what people, especially young people, are hungering to know more about. So I would agree with you. Use your voice wherever you can to talk about what means the most to you.
The other thing that I would say is that don't be afraid about speaking out, because it's a big tent out there. It's 1.3 billion Roman Catholics. I mean, if someone's going to disagree with your opinion, peace to them. I mean, it doesn't really, it's not going to, change the course of the universe. I mean, it's a big tent out there. If you have an opinion that you're speaking out on, and someone comes down on you really hard and criticizes you for having an opinion of that kind, or disagrees with you, so be it. I mean, this is why we tend to get, also, we in the media, for example, I mean, right, the very conservative wing of the church is much more vocal on social media, much more. There's no comparison. So people are criticizing the Pope. They're much more savvy than others. So they're getting a lot of attention, but numerically, they are not as big as their megaphone would have you believe. So it's a big tent out there. You shouldn't be afraid of speaking your mind.
Some other comments and questions from the English room. I like to hear, Philippe, a little more on how a thing's coverage by not Catholic could help us. We always said it helps to have a good understanding of church realities, but perhaps in the end, it makes us be less objective. It's a question. Then we have a comment for both of you.
Let's do one at a time.
Okay.
Yeah, because then I think that when I said that, I was speaking specifically about covering the Vatican. Okay. You do not have to be Catholic to cover the Vatican. You have to be a good reporter. You have to be a fair reporter, because the Vatican is an institution. It happens to be the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church, but it's an institution. It's a bureaucracy. Speaking for myself, I cover the Vatican the way I would cover the White House, or where I would cover the Supreme Court or the State Department, warts and all. If I let my religion get in the way of me being a good reporter, then I'm going to have a problem. So my own personal, I was raised a Catholic, but I'm not going to tell you whether I practice or not now, because it has nothing to do with my job. See? So what I'm saying is that if you cover the Vatican, in my opinion, you have to be a journalist first and a Catholic second. You can't be a Catholic first and a journalist second, because then it'll may block you from covering it impartially. And that's what I meant by that. That's for the, I wasn't talking about local issues. We're talking of the Vatican as an institution, and that needs to be covered. And you do not have to be Catholic. You can be, you know, there are reporters who cover the world of science that are not scientists, etc. You need to be well informed about. We reporters write about, reporters who are not Muslims write about the Islamic world, and they're not, you know, they're not Muslims. So as an institution, clearly, if you are Catholic and have a Catholic upbringing, and you are, you know, well documented in the history of the Catholic Church and the teachings of the Catholic Church, it helps. But you could also acquire that knowledge even if you're not Catholic. And many times I've found that actually, if you really are interested in an institution and you don't come from it, actually you make more of an effort sometimes to get to know that institution, right? You know, how many Catholics have read Gaudium et Spes, you know, or any of the documents of the Second Vatican Council? You know, I would say a very small number have. But I've run into people who are not Catholic who wanted to cover the Catholic Church properly and have gone out and read Gaudium et Spes. And I said, well, you're a better person than I am, because I've never read it.
Thank you for both of you. I have a final comment and another question, and then we are going to close. The comment is, no matter how strongly you say it's person, it's related with the, I cannot speak on my personal level, or no matter how strongly you say it's person, the perception is usually that as a sister, you are seen as speaking for the whole. If your personal comment is not in keeping with the congregation's message, what does that suggest? It's just a comment. If your personal comment is not in keeping with the message, the congregation message, what does that suggest? The question, for both of you. Does the press want to know more about the difference in the values or ways of living that are genuine to women religious in the church that do not necessarily have example in the male voice of the church?
Could you repeat that? Repeat the question?
You want to read it? Perhaps it's better than in your English, in your real English, and not in my English. Our communicators are in trouble. It's interesting.
Now we're taking my phone. This one here, does the press want to know more about the difference in values or ways of living that are genuine to women? I'm just reading it, women religious in the church that do not necessarily have an example in the male voice. I'm not sure whether the sister, okay, I'll read it again because I'm not sure if it's totally clear to me. Does the press want to know more about the difference, in quotes, in the values or ways of living that are genuine to women religious in the church that do not necessarily have an example in the male voice of the church? If I understand it correctly, I think that yes, I think the media is interested in knowing the difference of opinion between men and women in the church. I think what we were saying before is that it's a question of whether women in the church can reach a point where they can make decisions in the central apparatus of the church. We already know in countries such as the United States, there are a lot of women, lay women and sisters in diocesan councils and all kinds of things like that. Whereas in other countries, there are still very, very few women religious who have a say in the running of an archdiocese, for example, depending on what country you're in. You know, whether you're in Latin America, Africa. I mean, you would know more than I do about that. But I think that Pope Francis himself, the Vatican in general, but Pope Francis himself can do much more in getting qualified women, and there is absolutely no lack of them, sisters or lay women. But let's just concentrate, since of where we are now and who we're talking with. Let's just sisters now. There is no lack of qualified sisters who can get into who could run Vatican departments that do not require ordained orders, and yet there are not many there. I am against quota systems, but I think that if people choosing positions in the Vatican looked a little bit further afield, or like the bluebird of happiness, perhaps just in your own backyard, you would find very qualified sisters who could do the job just as well, if not better, than men. And we've kind of sort of stayed at this level of about 5 or 6 women, sisters, that have sort of decision making, you know, in the curia. And that's really, really, I would have hoped that after 6 or 7 years, they would have had more. I'm hopeful. There are a couple of openings now. For example, you know, in the Secretariat for the Economy, there is no reason why a qualified sister cannot. You don't need to be an ordained minister. There are a number of people that I can think of. And in communications and others, you know, I think that some opportunities were missed. When I interviewed the Pope, he told me that he was considering a woman to have a top job in communications, but then she herself had to withdraw because of personal reasons, and I don't know who that person was. But I think that there should be more, and it's really not that difficult to find them, I think.
Okay, I think we can go to close this conversation. Thank you very much, Philippe and Annmarie. But I have just a final question. I invite you to answer very shortly. And the question is, which is, in your opinion and in your experience, 2 challenges that we as religious life, we have to face in the next 3 years, 5 years in terms of communication? 2 challenges. 3, 1.
We're just going to repeat ourselves, right? Because I think we've gone through is to feel more comfortable with the media, to communicate more, communicate better. If you haven't communicated, learn how to communicate. If you don't want to communicate yourself, then find somebody in your order who is comfortable communicating, and get more exposure for what you're doing, particularly in the local media. And I continue stressing that the local media loves a good local story. The national media is so taken up by other things and bigger stories that they're just going to, you know, you're going to write about a group of nuns who are helping AIDS victims. We know that happens, right? But in local media, you know, it's a good story. So concentrate on the local media. You'll find a willing ear, and you'll also get experience in dealing with the media if you haven't, before you sort of move up the ladder, so to speak, to the national media. In which case, then you have experts such as Sister Annmarie who can guide you if you need guidance.
Yeah, you stole my tips. I think I would have said that same one about the local media, that I think sometimes as women religious, we tend to forget how many opportunities we have to use the local media much more effectively. And I'm not sure if this is the case in all countries, but radio, I think, is sometimes a neglected medium that often is looking for some good programming and perhaps would be interested in having a sister's voice heard more regularly. And then the second, I would like to offer a second tip or hope would be what I mentioned before, that sisters could get more comfortable speaking about what's really at the heart of our lives. Why do we do what we do? And to speak more freely about that and more openly to help meet that hunger, that spiritual hunger that exists in the world today. That I think there's something that people trust when Catholic sisters speak about their own spirituality or experiences of prayer.
I would like to just add one thing which came to mind now, is that I think that sisters around the world can take advantage, and I mean, I'm choosing my words carefully, but I don't want you to exploit the situation, but take advantage of the fact that sisters today, because of the sexual abuse crisis, are much, much more trusted than men. Had there been more sisters in charge of parishes and, you know, working closer in parishes with more positions of authority in parishes at the diocesan level and at the international level, including here at the Vatican, the sexual abuse crisis would not have carried on the way it did, because maternal instincts, and I say this in a very, very positive, genuine sense, they would have said, you know, oh, hang on a bit, we're not going to cover this up anymore. So you are in a really good position now because you are trusted more than men. I think that that's, to me, it's obvious. And you can sort of take advantage of this opportunity to say what you want to say and get your point across.
Thank you. Thank you very much again for your contribution, for sharing your reflection. Thank you for participating, to you and to the people who follow online. Thank you to the translators that we cannot see, but they are downstairs. I want just to highlight your attention that the USG is planning many meetings, events for the Synod. And so please pray tomorrow for the press conference, because we have to give a good image of what, I mean, the right image of what Religious Sisters is contributing within the Synod and in the Amazon area. All the events are on our website. I want just to highlight the last meeting that will be October 28. That is a meeting after the Synod as a follow-up of the Synod with the 10 sisters who represented the USG at the Synod. So they will tell us how it went, you know, so it's a huge opportunity to listen their experience. And it will be in 4 or 5 languages. We are still working on that. So, and they will speak Spanish and Portuguese. So you're most welcome. So thank you again. But before we leave, we want just to give a small gift to you, because you were very nice to accept our invitation. It's just a symbolic invitation, gift. Yeah. Well, thank you. And for the people who register for the workshop, you are most welcome. Tomorrow morning, we start the registration at 8:30, and the workshop won't be online, unfortunately. So you can invite Annmarie in your countries for the people who are following online. Thank you very much.